And I'm back once again, this time to conclude our time together by discussing the selections from Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. I want to begin by reminding us of de Beauvoir's distinction between ambiguity and absurdity. Absurdity means that life is meaningless, and de Beauvoir does not regard life as meaningless. She regards good and bad in human life as ambiguous. We are objects, things in the natural order of things, compelled to act in different ways, but always under conditions of uncertainty. Nevertheless, the conditions of human life are not without value and meaning, right? Our commitments and our choices create meaning, but even deeper than that, if we understand the nature of our individual freedom, we will acknowledge and will the freedom of all people. Right? So the ethical foundation of de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity is in fact a conception of human beings as ends in themselves, as intrinsic values. And she contrasts this with the view, also important in existential philosophy, that life is absurd. Camus, as I said last discussion, looks more deeply into the dark of human life. He does maintain that life is absurd. Right? Why might he maintain that? Well, we have to keep in mind that French existential philosophy really comes of age in the post-World War II period. And what happened in World War II, the Holocaust on the one hand, right, unprecedented life destruction on the other, but also in the case of France, collaboration with the Nazi regime. And these three factors serve to undermine, in a certain number of artists and philosophers, undermine the perhaps naive beliefs in the meaning and goodness of human life. And Camus takes that as far as it can go, and he maintains that if we stick with what we know, right, if we confine our judgments and evaluations to the limits of human experience, we must conclude that life is absurd. It means nothing in and of itself. It means nothing in and of itself because we are mortal. We are born and we die. And once we die, there's no consciousness of our ever having lived. And even if we are great artists or scientists or politicians, all of our creations will eventually go to be ground down to dust, right? There's a wonderful poem by Percy Shelley called Ozymandias, and it is concerns the ruins of a great temple. And Ozymandias was the creator of the temple, and he created it to, exalt himself through all the ages. But he's dead, and the temple is collapsing, right? Everything that human beings create will ultimately disappear, and so ultimately nothing has any meaning or purpose. Once we recognize that fact, Camus says, the only important philosophical question is whether we ought to keep living. So this is the first sentence of the selection that I asked you to read. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. Right? So that's as stark a choice as can be put to a human being. Right? The only important philosophical question is whether to choose life or death in light of the conclusion that human life is absurd. And, following Nietzsche, The philosopher has to put their decision into practice. If life is worth living, then they have to live it. And if life is not worth living, then they have to show by example that it's not and actually commit suicide. These are not academic questions for Camus, right? Camus was an artist as much as he's a philosopher. He was involved in the French Resistance, right? These are not academic questions. Philosophical questions are practical questions. How do we live, right? And in choosing life, we have to choose, if that's what in fact we do choose, in light of what we know, not what we hope, not what we imagine, not what we construct, right? Again, like de Beauvoir and like existential philosophy in general, Camus commits himself to knowledge within the frames of human reference. Right? We have no certain knowledge of any transcendent values, God, heaven, Platonic forms. We only know that we live and we die, and whatever we create will eventually be ground down to dust. And when we confront ourselves with that choice, can we still continue to live? And Camus' answer is yes, absolutely we can. He doesn't moralize, right? It's equally plausible that people feel undermined by the weight of absurdity, and they make other choices. But it is completely possible to accept A, that life is absurd, and B, that it's still worth living. And it's worth living, according to Camus, not in the service of any abstract ideal, the good with a capital G in Plato's sense. It's worth living because it's simply an opportunity to maximize experience. He says in the second selection that I asked you to read, what counts is not the best living, but the most living. Right? So the person who accepts the absurdity of life throws themselves into experience, not willy-nilly, right? But savoring and paying attention to and drawing lessons from and enjoying, but also suffering, everything that life presents. But once again, as with de Beauvoir, the other side of the most living is accepting responsibility. There is no God to offload responsibility onto. There is no overarching natural determinism. We have to be responsible to ourselves. Right? The limits of human knowledge means that we don't know whether the divine will has organized everything. Nor can we say definitively that everything that happens for a precedent because of a precedent cause, and therefore we have no free will. Right? Human freedom is not a metaphysical issue; it's a practical issue. Freedom versus determinism is as meaningless a metaphysical argument as the existence or non-existence of God. We don't have access to those ultimate truths. All we know is that we wake up in the morning and we have to decide whether to continue on with the day or not. And as we go throughout that day, we constantly have to choose. It's the choosing, the embracing the freedom, the practical freedom of having to choose that lies at the foundation of getting the most out of life. But getting the most out of life doesn't mean that we somehow overcome the absurdity. Nothing overcomes absurdity. That's with us constantly. So there's a perpetual intensity to life lived in this way. And that was also reflected in de Beauvoir, even though she didn't agree that life was absurd. Right? When we live without supports, metaphysical supports, religious supports, ideological supports, right? When we are conscious every moment that the only thing that keeps us alive, keeps us going, is our decision to do it, that really connects us with the possibility of creating meaning and value, right? Meaning and value is not something we find ready-made. We have to create it. And isn't that the best thing, Camus says, right? We're totally free. We invent the values and the goods that we commit ourselves to. Right? Of course, when we stare into the abyss, our future non-existence forever, it's terrifying, right? It shakes us to the foundations. But that's why we should do it all the time. Right? We should be constantly confronting ourselves with the absurdity of life because of the finality of death, because that engages us with the hard business of living. So the final section I asked you to read concerns creation. And when I was discussing de Beauvoir, she also made reference to the importance of art and artistic creation. But I wanted to wait until we came to Camus. De Beauvoir also wrote literature, and some of it's good. I've read a book of hers called All Men Are Mortal. But Camus was one of the great writers of the 20th century, Nobel Prize winner. Better known for his novels, especially The Plague, as I mentioned earlier, very appropriate one to read in our moment, and also The Stranger. The stranger concerns a person who simply cannot connect to other people and simply treats everybody as a thing. He's completely alienated from the whole world. And that can happen, right? If we're committed to, I mean, if we believe that life is meaningless, then other people have no value either, right? We can't. Camus does not believe that anything in particular follows from existential freedom. De Beauvoir maintains that if we understand our own freedom, we will understand everyone else's freedom. That is not necessarily the case, according to Camus. So the stranger concerns the type of global alienation from other people that we can suffer as a result of concluding that life is absurd. On the other hand, the plague explores the opposite possibility, that we commit ourselves all the more deeply to each other's well-being precisely because we're alone and all in this together. Right? As I think I mentioned in the plague, the plague comes to Oran, a town in Algeria, and most people flee, but some people have to the whole town is going to be consumed unless some people stay behind to help fight it. And a group of people led by the protagonist, Dr. Ruyur, they stay behind to fight it. Not because it's going to save humanity, but because it's their community and they commit themselves to it, right? And it's not heroism, at least in Camus' presentation. It's not because they're heroes or saints or anything. It's just groundless commitment to each other and to their community. So these are the poles that Camus explores in his art, right? On the one hand, global alienation and simply living for yourself and not really caring about anybody else. On the other hand, throwing yourself as deeply and passionately as you can into a commitment to collective well-being. But nothing causes us to be one rather than the other. Only our own choices, only our own decisions. So for Camus, artistic creation is exemplary precisely because it is a creation out of nothing. Right? It's a creation of meaning and value out of nothing. Nature is neither beautiful nor ugly. Human beings are neither beautiful nor ugly. We have to create all of this through our own actions. And so he says in as good a definition of art as I have ever heard, artistic creation gives colors to the void. Right? It doesn't make life meaningful. It doesn't redeem it. It doesn't save us from death or sin or the possibility of bad outcomes. What art does is to create meaning in a meaningless world, but that meaning is also ephemeral, right? The section in which he says that is called ephemeral creation.